American record, the kickback, the FIFA case. For decades, it was the single most powerful organization in global sports, the governing body of soccer in over 200 countries, the operator of the World Cup, and the gatekeeper for billions of dollars in broadcasting and sponsorship money every year. Then, before dawn on May 27, 2015, plainclothes Swiss police walked into a five-star hotel in Zurich and arrested several of its top officials, just 2 days before FIFA's own presidential election was set to take place a few blocks away. By the time the U.S. investigation was finished, prosecutors had uncovered more than $150 million in bribes and indicted over 40 individuals and entities spread across 4 continents. This is the story of how it happened, and what the case actually proved, and what it didn't. Chapter 1. The Institution. To understand how this happened, you need to understand what FIFA actually is. It isn't just a sports league, it's the governing body that controls the World Cup, the single most watched event on the planet, along with the broadcasting rights, sponsorships, and hosting decisions that come with it. Underneath FIFA sit 6 regional confederations: CONCACAF for North and Central America, and the Caribbean, CONMEBOL for South America, UEFA for Europe, and others, each with its own president, its own votes at FIFA's annual Congress, and its own slice of the revenue that flows down from the top. Here's the detail that matters. FIFA is technically a non-profit association, registered under Swiss law and headquartered in Zurich. That meant it operated for decades, with far less financial oversight than a public company would face anywhere else in the world. No shareholders demanding transparency, no regulator like the SEC looking over its shoulder, and financial disclosures that were, for years, whatever FIFA itself decided to disclose. Whoever controlled that small circle of officials controlled the money. And prosecutors say that for more than 2 decades, dating back to the early 1990s, that circle treated FIFA's business and the businesses of its regional confederations like a private account they could dip into more or less at will. Chapter 2. The Players. A handful of names anchor this case. Sepp Blatter, FIFA's president from 1998 to 2015, was publicly the face of global soccer, shaking hands with presidents and royalty, presiding over opening ceremonies watched by billions. Prosecutors say that privately, he presided over a culture that let corruption flourish underneath him for years, even though he himself was never criminally charged in the U.S. case. Jack Warner, a former FIFA vice president from Trinidad and Tobago, controlled votes across CONCACAF for years as its president. Prosecutors alleged he used that control to solicit and accept bribes tied to World Cup hosting decisions and broadcasting deals, including, they say, a $10 million payment connected to South Africa's successful bid to host the 2010 World Cup, money prosecutors described as effectively a bribe routed through official channels. Chuck Blazer, an American FIFA executive and Warner's longtime general secretary at CONCACAF, became the government's star witness. Blazer lived large, a private Manhattan apartment on Trump Tower's 49th floor, and a separate apartment down the hall just for his cats. Funded, prosecutors said, by nearly 2 decades of bribes, kickbacks, and unreported income. Facing his own tax evasion and fraud charges, he quietly pleaded guilty in 2013 and flipped secretly recording fellow officials for the FBI at the 2012 London Olympics and in the years that followed. Around them sat a much wider network, CONMEBOL presidents like Eugenio Figueiredo and Nicolás Leoz, Venezuelan Federation President Rafael Esquivel, and marketing executives from sports media companies who paid the bribes on the corporate side to win broadcast contracts. This wasn't three rogue officials acting alone. It was an entire ecosystem built around the same basic transaction, repeated across confederations and decades. Not everyone faced the same consequences on the same timeline. Warner fought extradition from Trinidad and Tobago to the United States for years afterward and, as far as the public record shows, never stood trial there. Blazer, the man whose cooperation cracked the case open in the first place, died in 2017, before he could see how much of the story his recordings had helped expose would ultimately play out in court. Chapter 3. The Scheme. So how does bribery inside international soccer actually work in practice? Mostly, it ran through media and marketing rights. Sports marketing companies wanted exclusive deals to broadcast tournaments like the Copa America, the Copa Libertadores, and World Cup qualifiers across Latin America and the Caribbean. Deals worth tens of millions of dollars apiece. To win those contracts, prosecutors say, those companies paid bribes to the FIFA and confederation officials who controlled who got the deal. In exchange, officials steered contracts toward whoever paid the largest bribe, not whoever actually offered the best deal for the sport. Prosecutors traced the money through shell companies and offshore accounts, wired between Switzerland, the Caribbean, and the United States. And it's that last piece, the use of American banks to move the money, that gave U.S. prosecutors jurisdiction over what was, on paper, a Swiss organization's business. Sports marketing firms based in the U.S. and South America, companies most fans had never heard of, with names like Traffic Sports and Full Play Group, sat at the center of these deals, negotiating broadcast rights on one side, while allegedly funneling bribe payments on the other. This wasn't the first warning sign. Back in 2011, Qatari official Mohammed bin Hammam challenged Blatter for the FIFA presidency and was accused of distributing cash-filled envelopes to Caribbean delegates at a meeting hosted by Jack Warner in Trinidad, allegedly to buy their votes. Bin Hammam was later banned from soccer for life over the allegations. It was an early, very public preview of exactly the culture the 2015 indictments would describe in far greater detail. Then came the part that made international headlines: the World Cup hosting votes. In December 2010, FIFA awarded the 2018 World Cup to Russia and the 2022 World Cup to Qatar in the very same afternoon. Decisions that stunned the sports world and instantly drew accusations that votes had been bought. FIFA had even commissioned its own internal investigation into the bidding process, led by American attorney Michael Garcia. But when FIFA released only a summary of his findings rather than the full report, Garcia resigned in protest, calling the summary a materially incomplete representation of his work. It's worth being precise about what was and wasn't proven, because this gets blurred constantly. The U.S. investigation never established beyond doubt that the 2018 or 2022 hosting votes themselves were directly bribed. What it did establish was a voting system so opaque and a leadership so demonstrably compromised on nearly everything else that the world had every reason to keep asking the question anyway. Chapter 4. The Investigation. Here's what most people don't know. This case wasn't cracked by soccer regulators, and it wasn't cracked in Switzerland. It was cracked by the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in the United States, using the RICO Act, a law originally written in 1970 to prosecute the mafia, applied here to a Swiss sports federation for the first time. The investigation took years, built quietly and methodically through grand jury subpoenas, financial records pulled from banks on multiple continents, and, critically, Chuck Blazer wearing a wire into conversations with his former colleagues, first at the 2012 London Olympics and continuing afterward, all while publicly still functioning as a FIFA Executive Committee member. When the indictments were finally unsealed, U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced them personally at a press conference in Brooklyn, describing corruption that was, in her words, rampant, systemic, and deep-rooted, both on the field and off it. The charges didn't stop at low-level officials. They hit sitting FIFA vice presidents and executive committee members. Weeks later, the pressure became so intense that Blatter, freshly re-elected to a fifth term as president just 2 days after the arrests, reversed course and announced he would step down. He was never criminally charged in the U.S. case, but the resignation, coming days after he'd just won another term in an election he insisted he'd earned fairly, told its own story about how untenable his position had quietly become. Swiss authorities opened their own separate criminal proceedings against Blatter around the same time, focused on that disputed payment to Michel Platini, a reminder that this was never a single investigation in a single country, but several overlapping ones running on parallel tracks. Chapter 5. The Fallout. In the years that followed, the case rippled outward across the sport. More than 20 individuals and corporate entities eventually pleaded guilty in the U.S., and others were convicted at trial. Blatter was never criminally convicted in the American case, but FIFA's own independent ethics committee separately banned both him and UEFA President Michel Platini from all soccer activities over an unrelated 2 million Swiss franc payment Blatter had authorized to Platini years earlier, a ban both men disputed for years afterward. The two later faced a related criminal trial in Switzerland over that same payment and were acquitted there in 2022, a reminder that the U.S. case and the various Swiss proceedings were never quite the same story. Outside the legal system, sponsors like Coca-Cola, Visa, and Adidas, companies that had spent decades attaching their brand to FIFA's clean, family-friendly image, publicly demanded reform for the first time in the organization's history, turning corporate money into a lever for accountability in a way soccer's own governance structures never had managed on their own. FIFA elected a new president, Gianni Infantino, in early 2016, promising transparency and structural reform going forward. Infantino has since faced his own controversies, including a Swiss criminal probe into a series of private, undisclosed meetings he held with the country's attorney general, an inquiry that ultimately did not result in charges against him. Whether the reform he promised in 2016 has fully materialized is still something fans, journalists, and former FIFA insiders debate today. The confederations at the center of the scandal went through their own overhauls. CONCACAF brought in new leadership and outside compliance monitoring after Warner's exit, and CONMEBOL cycled through several presidents of its own in the years that followed, as more officials were swept up in related prosecutions on both sides of the Atlantic. Chapter 6. Why it still matters. Strip away the soccer, and this case is really about something broader. What happens when an institution controls enormous amounts of money, spans dozens of legal jurisdictions, and answers to almost no external authority but itself? Concentrated power, weak transparency, and a culture where insiders protect insiders. Until an outside force, in this case American prosecutors reaching across the Atlantic with organized crime law, finally forces a reckoning, the institution was never going to force on itself. Next time you watch a World Cup opening ceremony, remember, the trophy on that stage passed through the hands of a system that, for the better part of 3 decades, ran on exactly this. It's also worth remembering how this case actually got made, not by soccer's own governing bodies policing themselves, but by outside investigators in a different country entirely, applying laws that had nothing to do with sports, because the institution closest to the problem had every incentive not to look too closely at itself. So here's the debate worth having. Did the US case actually clean up FIFA? Or did it just take down the specific people who happened to get caught? While the underlying structure that let this happen remains largely in place under new management, 10 years on, with a new World Cup cycle already underway, that's still an open question. Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you in the next file.